you so much for staying for this talkback. My name is Amy Marie Seidel, and I was the Dramaturg, the Associate Director, and one of the many devisers on this project. And it has been one of my great honors to work with FASPE, Fellowships at Auschwitz for the Study of Professional Ethics over the last couple years of our development of the play. And so without further ado, I'll introduce these lovely people. To my left is Thorsten Wagner. He's a historian with degrees in modern history, political science, and German literature. He was an educator at the Jewish Museum of Berlin, a research fellow at the Danish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen. He's the executive director at FASPE and has been a thought partner and advisor to Tectonic through the development of the play. And then this is Deepa Shivaram. She's a multi-platform political reporter at NPR's Washington desk, covering domestic and international breaking news. She's covered the Biden administration and issues like the immigration debates around Title 42 and the leaked Supreme Court opinion on Roe v. Wade. She was previously a political reporter at NBC and a producer for Meet the Press. Deepa is a recent FASPE Journalism Fellow alum. So without further ado, I will turn it into our lovely guests.
That was a very kind intro. I think the FASPE part should have been like way at the top, just because that is easily the most fun part of all of that in the bio. But yes, I was lucky enough to be a 2022 journalism fellow with FASPE last summer. It was the best, greatest fellowship I could have imagined. It's fully funded, which gives so many of us such great opportunities when we don't have to worry about the cost. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'm going to scoot back so I can see you as well. And I think the way I would describe it is that it was just a great big stretch for my brain. Like, you know, when you wake up in the morning and you just do a really good stretch and it feels really good. And I needed that. And then there's also the kind of stretches that you do sometimes where you kind of like shift your background and you're like, oh, that kind of hurt a little bit. Like, I don't really know what's going on there. And you kind of have to sit with that a little bit and figure out, okay, why was that painful? Like, let's maybe figure that out. And that is my metaphor for what FASPE was for me. And so it's really a treat to be back here with Thorsten. He was kind of our, great leader through the 2 weeks we spent together last summer, and it's fantastic to be back here. The play, I'm sure we can all agree, was amazing. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was really great to be there, and it's now nice to kind of have this conversation. And I know we have limited time, so I'll jump right in. And this is something we talked about, kind of the play addressed this in the very beginning, but I want to get your reaction, Thorsten, when you first saw these photographs, the Blueberry picture, what was your response? What was your emotional reaction to that?
Well, the interesting thing about it is, of course, that on the one hand we have our professional brains, and so much of the play is about being historians, so I can connect to that, but there's a deeper level for me as well, and that is when I see these photos, particularly of the younger people, the younger German people, the younger German girls, I see my mother. I see her, who is a little bit younger than the Helferin, but she's part of that culture, and it creates this interesting but also emotionally challenging connection for me to place my mother's normalcy with this extraordinary sight of mass murder and genocide.
Yeah, that must be a strong feeling overall. That's definitely a little unnerving. And with that, I mean, let's go into the why. When we see these pictures, the ones that were playing up on screen the entire time during the play, what is at the root of our kind of discomfort looking at this? I think one of the characters in the play said at one point that we don't want to look at it for too long. It's disconcerting. It's definitely kind of uncomfortable. Why is that? What explains some of that feeling?
I personally find that one of the most powerful aspects of the play, and worth reflecting more on also. Where does that irritation come from when we watch the people sunbathing at Zollahütte, the banter, the presumed innocence, the leisure, the fun? Does it have to do with the tension, with us knowing that Birkenau is so close by, with what happens at the same time also, or at least happened a few days and weeks before that? It might also have a lot to do with our expectations, and it's referenced a few times in the wonderful script also, the conversations, that we might expect to see sociopaths, that we might expect to see monsters, some kind of robotic, inhuman creatures, or at least some kind of signs of bad conscience or guilt. But what we see is something very different. And what we see, for me at least, is that these, particularly the young women, lead us back to think about ordinary German society.
And that normalness of it, the normalcy of these pictures, that's a lot of things to grapple with, and some of this also is, that presumed normalcy. We talked about this the other week, which was that normalness doesn't happen at once. It happens over time. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, for me, the play was another push really to rethink the relationship between normalcy and barbarism, and to reflect on, there's so many ways that we can think of the Lily Jacob album, and some people have said that shows the reality of Auschwitz, and that in so many ways, of course, makes a lot of sense. But there's also a dark truth to the fact that the Höcker album shows the reality of Auschwitz, in that sense that there's something problematic if we try to get a sense of what's going on there, but we start with the gas chambers, we start with the mass murder, and we might underestimate how much that moment of genocide and these years of genocide, of course, are a result of a whole process that leads to that point. And that is anchored in that normalcy in many ways, in that context. So that we need to realize, if we don't want it to be enigmatic and erratic and incomprehensible, we need to think of that as a process of a whole society that gets to the point that they think this is normal.
Right, because as they said in the play, a lot of us, and many of us, think of this as, genocide happening all at once, and there are so many things that happen to normalize this before we even get to that point. In other words, we can't look at it backwards, right? We have to start from the very beginning, which I think this play did a really extraordinary job of illustrating. The other question that we kind of talked about too was, they look the way they do in these pictures. They look happy, they look content. And part of that question is that they themselves might feel morally okay with what they were doing. This was not a conscious question that they were necessarily grappling with. The play addresses that, and I'm curious if you could speak to some of that as well.
Well, the question that I'm asking myself is, where does this, what you guys have made into a so powerful and challenging play, where does it fit into what we know about German society, about the history of Nazism, the history of the Holocaust? And for me, that, of course, connects with the self-perception of these different groups that we see in the play, particularly both the perpetrators, the real bad guys, but also these Helferinnen, who, yes, they are SS, but in many ways, of course, they are also just these 17, 20, 22-year-olds. And as you said, they seem so much to be in balance and chill and just okay with where they are in that moment. And I've brought something for us today. I hope that we can share that for a moment, that I think is even going to reinforce some of that reflection. It's an excerpt from a speech that some of you might know. It's a speech that is given by the boss of many of the people that we've seen here, and that's Heinrich Himmler. And I assume that most of the people in this room are aware of that Himmler, in the moment at the early 40s, is the head of the SS, the head of the police, the head of the whole terror apparatus, that in many ways, of course, not only has suppressed resistance and persecuted people who had other political views, but also really set up the persecution of Europe's Jews and other victim groups at this time. And Himmler gives a speech, actually two, early October 1943, in Posen, a then German city that we today think of as a Polish city, Poznan. And what I'd like to share with you is just a 2-3 minute excerpt from the first speech on October 4th. So just in terms of the setting, I want us to imagine as we guess, an auditorium, a room with somewhere in the order of 90 plus high-ranking SS officers. Himmler's speech is 3 hours, as I said. We'll listen to 3 minutes. The interesting thing is that a lot of the speeches by Himmler were recorded, at least in terms of having the text, but quite a few also as an audio recording. And that's why we can listen to it. And I know it's rough, but we've already gone through a lot with the play, right? Challenge ourselves here. We'll hear Himmler just speak for 3 minutes, and you will see, of course, also the translation if this all works out in a moment. And then I'd like us to think about how that in many ways both play and this excerpt speaks to each other. Can we try to listen to that for a moment?
Ich meine, die Judenevangelium, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk ist ausgerottet. Fast in jeder Verteidigung. Das gab es in unserem Programmrecht. Aus Zeichen der Judendausrottung machen wir fast Gleichheit. Und dann kommen sie alle die braven 80 Millionen Deutschen, jeder hat seinen anständigen Juden, seit einfach nur den Schwein. Er ist ein prima Jude. Und so gesehen, durchgeschlossen hat keiner. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichenmesser liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und das durchgehalten zu haben und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt. Denn wir wissen, wie schwer wir uns sehen, wenn wir heute noch in jeder Stadt bei den Hauptangriffen, bei den Lasten des Krieges und bei den Entbehrungen, wenn wir da noch die Juden als geheime Saboteure, Aggregatoren kennen. Wir würden wahrscheinlich in der Stadium des Jahres 76 jetzt gekommen sein, wenn die Juden noch die deutschen Volkskörper sehen. Die Reichtümer, die sie hatten, haben wir ihnen abgenommen und ich habe einen strikten Befehl gegeben, den Oberstropol durchgeführt hat. Wir haben diese Reichtümer restlos dem reichsten Staat abgeführt. Wir haben uns nichts davon genommen. Einzelne, die sich verfehlt haben, die werden gemäß einem von mir gegebenen Befehl, den ich am Anfang gab, wer sich auch nur eine Marke holen nimmt, ist des Todes. Die Anzahl ist Männer haben sich dagegen verfehlt, sind nicht sehr viele. Und sie werden des Todes sein. Gnadenlos! Wir haben das moralische Recht. Wir haben die Pflicht unserem Volk gegenüber das zu tun. Dieses Volk hat uns umbringen wollen, umzubringen. Wir haben aber nicht das Recht, uns auch nur mit einem Cent, mit einer Mark, mit einer Zigarette, mit einer Uhr, mit sonst etwas zu erreichen. Das haben wir nicht. Denn wir wollen nicht am Schluss, weil wir den Bacillus ausrotten, an den Bacillus Krankheiten sterben.
That's kind of the things where we all need to breathe first after listening to this. But the reason why I wanted to share that with all of you is that I sense a strong overlap here. That what we have in common in terms of some of the reflections in the play and with Himmler here is this notion of being the good guys. And I tend to take that seriously, that this is where they're coming from. We are zooming in on some of the top of the hierarchy of the criminals, of the mass murderers. But at the same time, Himmler and the SS at Auschwitz are, of course, embedded in a society that to some degree agrees with them. So for me, it boils down to one crucial question that I'm not even sure we have the full answer to, and that is, how is it possible that a culturally Christian modern society can become a society defined by radical exclusion within a few years and in a speed that many of its members do not even notice that normative shift that they themselves are part of, and they're able to align their own complicity in these crimes with the self-perception of being the good guys.
And this is where the concept of the professionalism comes in, right? If you guys remember the part in the play where I think it was Rebecca, the main character, is saying people really struggle with the doctors. They really struggle to put together, how can someone who is a professional, who went to medical school to train to do this, how could they take part in such a horrible thing? And that is a critical part of what we talk about in FASPE during our fellowship, because we're all professionals. I'm a journalist. We have lawyers there. We have folks who are doctors there. We have folks who work in faith. And we have people in business and design and technology. All of these industries played a role in contributing to all of this in some way, shape, or form, because I think there were people who stood around and said, you know what, I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing what I was trained to do. I'm not making all the decisions here. And let's break down some of that, because that is the big question at the end of the day, is how did we get to this point? And there are many myths, right, where we think, well, people just, they were just doing one cog in the machine, they weren't doing all the bad, but let's break down some of that. What were the arguments that people were making to kind of justify this and the whole I was just doing my job mentality?
For me, there are two things that come together. And in a moment, perhaps we just want to open up the floor and see if there are questions from the audience or comments also. So the two aspects that I just want to focus on, at least in our conversation here, is one, that arguably German society changes in terms of its normative orientations, and the professionals, the leaders, the elites play a central role in that change. But at the same time, of course, this is not necessarily about people who are diehard ideologues. Right? There is this great quote, looking through his files, Höcke doesn't seem to be an ideologue. He seems to be most interested in taking the next step on the career ladder. We see him again, happy rubbing elbows with the high command. And for me, that's the second component, that very often looking at the professionals, looking at different groups of Germans, individuals in German society at the time, we also find very ordinary motivations, very familiar driving motivations that end up making people complicit. Factors like ambition, competitiveness, focus on their career, pride and professional excellence, cleverness, or this ability to delegate more responsibility and to say what I am doing as a professional is neutral. What other people do with it is their job. And for me, it's really this kind of unholy alliance almost of that kind of normative transformation and these very ordinary motivations that we in so many ways can recognize, and as you know, is something that we try to also discuss in the context of the fellowships.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was, I think, the point in the play when Hooker was a bank teller and he just was trying to scale the career ladder. This was a very normal thing for him that was very clearly normalized throughout.
And if I may, one of our goals in making the play, I always talk about it in terms of ins, because Hooker had one reason that he was kind of climbing that ladder. Baumgartner had a different one. Edward Wirtz had a different one. And so one of our goals is to kind of take all these different ins, ways that people could have become Nazis. Melita had a different one. And so as we sit in the audience, I mean, I have the experience of watching Wirtz and thinking, oh no, maybe that would have been the path that I would have taken, because I like to go inside of circumstances and see if I can do good regardless of the circumstances. And one thing that really struck me of this excerpt from Himmler, he talks about how the Jewish people are basically like a sickness in the body of the German people. And I learned this through FASPE, so I can't take credit for this knowledge, and I learned through FASPE that that's how they validated the Hippocratic Oath to themselves, was that they were still healing by healing the German people, by eradicating the Jewish people from the German body. And that has stuck with me ever since.
It's really extraordinary when you when you get deep into it, and that is exactly what we do in the fellowship, is sit with these questions for 2 weeks. And you all kind of have to just realize that these are questions that we must ask ourselves every day, and that we do ask ourselves in our professional lives every day, that this is not a one and done issue. The question of, in these institutions that have done so much bad and so many negative things, can you still operate within the institution and do any good? And that is a critical part of the fellowship. I know that we want to turn to you guys to ask questions in just a little bit, but just an ending thought, Thorsten, for you. There was a line in the play that I think really stood out to both of us, and I'm kind of synthesizing it here, but essentially the line was that this album portrays the world that the Nazis wanted to live in. And I wonder if you could share your thoughts and your reflections on that.
What it reminds me of, that line, is, of course, the situation, let's say early 1941, for Germans, where a lot of Germans probably still had a hard time imagining themselves having a gun in their hand and shooting Jews into pits, or standing at Auschwitz and being the ones throwing in the Cyclone B. But what the vast majority of Germans had grown used to and had been part of, and at least had been indifferent, but very often had been complicit in or profited from, is of course the fact that they had created a society, to your question, where the parks were Jew-free, and the schools were Jew-free, and the cities were Jew-free, and that was the new normal. And that is what I take away also from this, and what we try to take into the fellowships, to realize how fast these things can change, how important ethics and morality is, okay, but also how we cannot rely on that is stable, and we need that constant reflection, particularly when you guys become professionals with influence. In one way as a journalist, in a different way as a lawyer, in a third way as a doctor, to think about your situation as people with influence and responsibility.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the best things about FASPE was that there was no question you couldn't ask. There was an open door to ask and ponder and self-reflect and do all of that in a space with folks who share the same profession as you, and also others who are in other professions, where somehow strikingly we have very similar issues and moral questions at the end of the day. And with all of that room to ask questions, I think we can now open up the questions to everyone here. If there are any in the audience, we can pass the mics around or handle that however is best. And if we could, keep them relevant to the topic, that would be helpful.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, you can shout it out in my direction and I will repeat it so that we can understand it. Yes? Thank you for your question. For anybody who didn't hear, this audience member shared that their father is a survivor of Auschwitz and was asking if we have reflected on the relevance today in America of the hardships that we're facing currently and what those parallels are between then and now. And I'll answer a little bit from the production perspective before I pass it on to y'all, but we absolutely have reflected on that, and I do think that that was one of the kernels for inspiration for Moises when he first realized that there was a play here. And of course, he's the kind of artist and we're the kind of company who wants the audience to make those connections on their own. Like they say about museums, we show original artifacts and we allow for people to come to their own conclusions, and we wanted to kind of do a similar thing here. But Moises, for good reason, I think always says, this is my most American play yet.
Just as a quick comment, a good friend of mine has been in the media a lot recently. His name is Timothy Snyder. He wrote a book back in, I think, 2015-16 that was called On Tyranny, where he addresses some of these references. And the gist of your question goes into the direction that I would see embodied both by the play in broader strokes and also by that book. But he also said something else, and there's a beautiful quote from Tim that I want to share with you. He wrote in his book Bloodlands, "It is easy to sanctify policies or identities by the deaths of victims. It is less appealing but morally more urgent to understand the actions of the perpetrators. The moral danger, after all, is never that one might become a victim, but that one might be a perpetrator or bystander." What I like about that so much is that it is so tempting to use history as a cudgel and as an argument, left against right and right against left, and I have my own political position, and that's not really interesting right now. What I'm just saying is, if we look at history and it seems to confirm our political views, we probably should be a little bit suspicious. And it might be very important, and that's what I see this play do. I think it's what FASPE tries to do. That is to say, let's use the critical and self-critical potential in history and think about ourselves and our weaknesses and the danger of complicity in these roles. And with that, of course, yes, absolutely, the responsibility that we have to keep and protect open societies and the rule of law.
Alrighty. In the black jacket, I saw your hand first.
Two things that cross my mind from a spiritual level is the beginning of the Garden of Eden, when the serpent says, if you bite this apple, you will know the difference between good and evil, and you will be like God. And that feeling in your heart when you see yourself being at that place where you can see clearly what's right, that's to be suspicious. And the other thing is the importance in our society that we put on the mind and knowing instead of the heart and the feeling. And it's difficult. It's just so difficult to be a human being and not influence and to try to keep our hearts clear and not know the difference. It's very difficult. I have compassion when I look at history. I feel each individual being told in their individual lives the decisions they made, just like we have in our lives, decisions, wondering.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. For anybody who didn't hear, I'm going to sum it up in a much smaller and less eloquent way than you just did, but talking about the idea that when, like the serpent says to Adam and Eve, that if you bite this apple, you will know the difference between good and evil, and that clear line being something that we should be suspicious about, as well as, it's so much easier for us to think with our heads than to actually understand where our hearts are pulling us in contemporary society, and I very much agree with that, so thank you. Yes?
Yeah, I want to ask a question about the context in which this killing was taking place, which it took place in Poland. I believe about 1% of the Germans were Jews. You often don't recognize that, but it was a very different ratio of Jews to Polish citizens. And the Germans put these camps in Poland, and the vast majority of the killing took place in Poland. And you mentioned bystanders. I mean, I visited Auschwitz, Treblinka. My father was a survivor. And the question that was on the minds of everybody on that day with Treblinka was more about the Poles. Because I can somehow imagine that if the Germans wanted to sort of seal off this horror from their own population, they would create these factories of death and bring the administrators in there, and the rest of Germany sort of would be sort of distanced from these events and not there. So I just wondered whether, as you work in this arena, which is the arena of Auschwitz and Birkenau and Poland, whether you've thought about sort of a bigger context, which may have helped these administrators of death do their job on a daily basis, as opposed to sitting in Munich or Berlin, and it is different kind of.
Just to repeat it very quickly for everyone, the question is, inside the context of Auschwitz in particular, and many of the concentration camps, they were built out far away in the east in Poland. And so the audience member is asking, how do we think about that context, that they were sent so far away, and how is that different from doing that job in, say, Berlin?
3 answers. My friends always make fun of me because I have 3 things that I want to say. First thing is, last week a larger academic conference took place in Berlin, finalizing or marking the completion of a huge project of editing sources related to the Holocaust from all over Europe. German and international scholars ended up producing 16 volumes, so it's a massive project. One of the takeaways, in the nutshell, was to see the massive degree of complicity of other European countries in the process. And that in no way takes anything away from what I feel as a German. That's a different topic, but I think that's an important aspect, of course, of that whole dimension at the same time. Secondly, for those of you who are following European news, or even for that matter Polish politics over the last days and even weeks, there's a very intense discussion again, but especially the last few days even, where a self-critical perspective by non-Jewish Polish historians on questions of collaboration and complicity has led to very strong reactions by the government or by other leaders connected with that. So in other words, there is of course a debate, but there's also a confrontation within Polish society about these questions. And of course I, as a German, would say that's for them, right? I'm not supposed to come in as the one with the lifted pointed finger there. Thirdly, there's one aspect that I would like us not to forget, and that is the reason that these countries, the Ukraine, Poland, parts of Russia, and other areas in the bloodlands became the place for what we then later have become used to call the Holocaust, was of course that there were the majority of European Jews lived in these areas, but secondly, of course, also that those were the areas where Germany embarked on a process of colonial warfare and destroyed states. The state of Denmark wasn't destroyed, Netherlands wasn't destroyed, the state of France wasn't destroyed, but Lithuania and Ukraine and Poland was. And that changes everything. And I think that's something we just need to keep in mind.
Thank you, Thorsten. Okay, I think this might be our last one. Yes, up there?
Very famous book written by Hannah Arendt, I think very relevant here, in which she talks about the trial of Eichmann and how it turned out to be sort of a disappointment because it revealed that Eichmann was not really a fanatic, he was not really an ideologue, he was just an ordinary guy. The book is called Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil. And she talks about how he just, when this was the law, he was just doing, he actually was just doing what he thought he was supposed to do as a good German citizen. And, you know, he sort of drank the Kool-Aid, and it seems to me that it's very relevant to this whole discussion if she's right about that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the audience member shared, many of us know the writings of Hannah Arendt on Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the idea of the banality of evil. And this audience member was asking the question, with Eichmann, not necessarily having been a fanatic and kind of just following in the footsteps of what he thought was next, having drank the Kool-Aid, and what our thoughts were on that.
I think that's an extremely important and helpful contribution. Just to draw on that and to think about Hannah Arendt in that context. I do agree that already more than, 60 years ago, we learned from that many of the perpetrators and the organizers were not particularly pathological, were not monsters. Even there were interviews run with some of the people that had been brought to Nuremberg, and some of the psychologists said, when I'm interviewing these perpetrators, I'm wondering whether I am less healthy than they are psychologically, right? So that's one part. On the other hand, and I know this sounds a little bit preposterous, I think there is a consensus that Hannah Arendt was wrong about some aspects, and that is the degree to which she underestimates Eichmann as a believer. Eichmann was not so far from Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism. He was driven. He knew what he was doing and why he was doing it, and that he, of course, presents himself as a cog in the machine, in the wheel, being brought to trial in Jerusalem is perhaps not so surprising. But we should not buy that necessarily. There was a lot of ideological conviction in his case at the same time.
All right, thank you all so much for a really compelling conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for coming to our play and staying for the extra time. Have a great evening. Thank you.